Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this morning. I'm Ranjana Khanna. I'm the director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, which is where you are at the moment. Starting last semester and then moving over the next semester, we're hosting a series of discussions about the humanities at Duke as a way of highlighting the distinctiveness of the effort at Duke, the ongoing high quality of research and scholarship in this area, and a commitment to a humanities education. As you know, the story goes that in the 1980s, a decision was made at Duke to become a top-notch university through a substantial investment in the humanities. An effort to hire scholars who were already established, who had a vision of what our fields could be, and also to hire people in turn who could continue that legacy. There was the attempt to create an institution that was novel in many ways, with leading and robust humanities, to train the future generation of teachers and scholars for the late 20th century and onwards, now into this century. And many of those people have remained some of the most significant scholars of our time. There was a lot of upheaval in humanities research at the time, of course, scholarly, political, intellectual, that allowed for new visions and sometimes total meltdowns. And, you know, I think that there were the share of those at Duke in a kind of legendary way. There was, however, you know, something that happens with those meltdowns, a recognition that there is a need for change. Right, a substantial need for change in fields, not just for the sake of it, certainly to build off the protocols of analysis that have been developed over centuries, but also to respond to such major factors as desegregation of universities, the women's movement, a sense of the necessity of a different kind of group of faculty and students that would be working together to develop new forms of thought. And also, of course, a relationship to the public as well, the town and gown relations that were sort of legendarily tense at the elite institutions in particular, right? So in this series so far that marks FHI's 25th anniversary and Duke's 100th, we've heard from Kathy Davidson and Carla Holloway on the idea of creating a humanities institute at Duke, specifically one that bore the name of John Hope Franklin. We've heard from Gregson Davis, who reflected on his career in the classics and comparative literature, and then as Dean of the Humanities, what he brought to Duke through a consideration of the structures of colonial education that cemented both a love and care for works that were shaping traditions and radically questioning them, and the particular moments of change he participated in as he moved from Antigua to Harvard, his time at Berkeley in the 60s, Stanford at the height of the culture wars, Cornell in the theory wars. We've had Stanley Fish and Jane Tompkins describe the ways in which they brought to what they brought to Duke, the ways in which they brought something to Duke, what it was possible to build and shape here in the 1980s and onwards, and a group of Eve Sedgwick's former students from around the early 1990s who were involved in an intellectual and political project of building something we now know as queer studies in relation to literary analysis and also in relation to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Of course, nothing can really happen at a university without the people who build the infrastructure. The majority of those people are often working very hard in the background to support our privilege of thought as university workers who expand bodies of knowledge and invite our students into sharing that exciting, heady space for us. with us. The background demands modesty and boldness, not an easy combination to come across, certainly a kind of rare thing among academics. But they're the people who begin to shape possibilities of thought that we have yet to imagine, actually, and also provide us with spaces and hospitality such that we can advance the knowledge, which I think most of us in this room would agree has to be maintained as the primary function of the university. Today, I'm really delighted to be in conversation with Beth Eastlick and Rob Sikorski, both of whom have that extraordinary, rare combination of qualities, I would say, of unbelievable modesty, as I think will come across, but really an incredibly bold vision of where we might be going. Beth has, well, actually, both Beth and Rob have ways in which their education itself shaped an idea of the humanities in an expanded form. Beth received her BA in history from Yale, went on to pursue a licence in economics at the Université de Genève, and also has an MPA from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So there is a kind of shaping in what we might understand as the interdisciplinary humanities, especially at a moment, which I think was something that I would like to discuss today, when economics and political sciences could really be understood as part of a humanities, as part of the humanities disciplines. Beth has worked in a number of positions at Duke, doing work in editorial spaces for actually the flagship journals, probably, of the university, and then shifting into the roles that have supported grant foundation and grant development and foundation relations over many years now. She is a highly experienced fundraiser with a proactive management style, demonstrated ability to facilitate agreement and among diverse stakeholders. She understands herself as a collaborator with knowledge of university priorities, coupled with detail-oriented focus and strategic decision-making capabilities. She has more than 35 years of experience in these areas and has moved into really demanding roles, including 27 years now in university development. And she has been engaged in raising an unbelievable $600 million for Duke since 2000, right? So, you know, enormous building of the institution that has gone on. And Rob, just to introduce you briefly, I really am going to let you listen to them in a moment. Rob has a master's degree in African studies and a law degree from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he was an associate editor of the school's law review and assistant editor of the Law and Society Review. And from 1990 to 2015, he held several positions at Duke related to international studies, including Slavic studies, European studies, international studies, and he was the inaugural director of operations for the John Hope Franklin Center, which is where FHI was originally housed. He was the first staff coordinator for the Office of International and Academic Programs under Vice Provost Peter Lang. And during his tenure in international studies, he authored or co-authored more than 20 successful grant applications to private foundations, including Ford, Mellon, Luce, Rauschenberg, Biddle, and Gould, and to governmental units, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the US Department of State, the US Department of Education, along with grants from the German federal government. And since his retirement, he has been engaged in a long-term research project, Getting the Wind Up, Understanding Folk Psychiatric Nosologies in the UK during the First and Second World Wars. Thank you both very much for being here today. It's a real privilege to be in conversation with you. And I want to actually just sort of start off by asking you both to say a little bit about how you came into these roles of supporting, writing grants, raising money for this. It was a career shift for both of you. And I'm interested to understand how that happened, why it happened, and why it happened.
Okay. One day in 1989, I think, Peter Lang called me and said, "Do you want to be our coordinator for European Studies?" I was unemployed at the moment. I said, "Sure, but you realize I know nothing about European Studies." He said, "That's okay. We know you can write grants," because I'd written grants for some of the other political science faculty. And that's where it started. We first negotiated with UNC to have a joint center, and then Peter liked my work and sort of took me along, and I got to know a lot of faculty, talk with a lot of faculty, take them out to dinner. That was incredibly important at one point, and I'm not even joking about that. That we came up with ideas. You know, I asked them, "What's your dream?" And through Beth and her predecessor, Mimi O'Brien, we started targeting places. And then Duke was on the map, and both Mellon and Ford asked us for proposals. And we, I guess, impressed them enough that they gave us a lot of money. So, yeah, that's basically, it was an accident.
So, as you mentioned, I had been working for Duke Press in a position split between economics and Duke Press, and was the managing editor of an economics journal. But the piece that is not in what you said is that that journal, the editor of that journal was Crawford Goodwin. And so I worked for Crawford for 7 years. And at that time, so Crawford didn't type. So this is going way back to when faculty did not type. And while I worked for Crawford, I worked with him on 4 books, on all of his syllabi, all of his tests, all of his correspondence for the journal. And Crawford was also a consultant to many of the major foundations. So he did consulting work for Mellon, Ford, Pew, German Marshall, the Japan Foundation, Luce Foundation. And everything he did, we would talk about, and he'd write, he would handwrite it, longhand, and I would type it up. So I got this fascinating window into how foundations work. And it was across, and Crawford was working across multiple program areas. He had an office at the Ford Foundation for 10 years. So I saw things that, you know, someone in my position wouldn't normally see. And then after I did my MPA, I was looking for a job, and Mary Jane Morrow called me up one day and said, "Have I got a job for you?" And that job was working for Bob Shepard, who was then head of development at Duke. And then within a couple of years, Mimi O'Brien hired me into foundation relations. So that early work with Crawford, which was sort of, you know, as an observer, stood me in good stead.
Can I say something about Crawford? He's one of the figures that is not celebrated to the extent that he should, because he also brought internationalization to Duke. He was one of the first directors of international studies, and he had a very strong, some of you probably know, interest in the humanities, given his interest in Bloomsbury and his collection. We're not talking idly. We're talking serious major collection. Some of you probably saw his exhibit at the Nasher. But also, when we were writing the proposal for the internationalization program at Duke, Peter read my draft and said, "This needs help." And where did it end up? With Beth. That's how, if I learned to write, that's how I learned to write.
I didn't know that early connection there. I mean, it strikes me that one of the things that is clear from what you've said just now, also the work of someone like Crawford. There was more. I mean, there was obviously a deep interest, a deep investment in the Bloomsbury Group. The work that he did was really in political economy as well, right? I mean, that was so that there was that side of the economics department that he really did develop that was on the history of political economy, which is something that still happens in economics, but it's actually shifted more into the humanities as a terrain of understanding, right, and of research. Certainly international studies, if one thinks about the history of area studies, is dominated by the social sciences, right? Political science, economics, certainly with language learning there, but not necessarily quite as humanities oriented as it has been at Duke and certainly was at that early moment, early for Duke anyway. I'm sorry, early for Duke, yes, in the internationalization project. So I'm curious to understand a little bit more how it is, from your point of view as fundraisers, how to understand this relationship between the social sciences and the humanities, which seems to have become, in some ways, a larger gap seems to have developed at this point, partly because the social sciences have become more oriented towards quantitative analysis, partly because something like political science has fewer political theorists, perhaps, than it once did. But I'm interested to understand that kind of how you managed those commonalities, differences, fields.
I guess that's for me mostly. Actually, I'm going to have to say it was a hard slog. We had graduate students who were interested in area studies, humanities, who were in the social sciences, who were told explicitly, do not get involved. We will penalize you. And on the other side, area studies was very skeptical and concerned that our truly interdisciplinary, interregional projects would damage them in the future. I think at least area studies was proven wrong. The investment in area studies may have been too much and too narrow, and we lost faculty who are interested in more interesting aspects of regional studies. And eventually, it was money that drew graduate students from the social sciences into more interdisciplinary groups. But we still basically had international studies, which ran a Ford Foundation grant before Oceans Connect for graduate students. We did have to have two strands, one which was more humanities, one which was more social sciences. But at a social level, where it can really matter, they interacted a lot. We had grad students who were working for us who were forced into dealing with the other disciplines. And I think it's always going to be on the, you hate this, and it's not a good idea in principle, but the humanities are always going to be the ones who have to deal with the social sciences. And it was, I mean, we created interpretive social sciences just to do that, which grabbed us cultural anthropology. It didn't get us much more than that. So, yeah.
So I also saw this sort of from the top down, which is that by the time I came on the scene and was really interactive with senior administration sometime after 2000, we had the first vice provost for international affairs, who I believe was Peter Lang.
Yes.
And, you know, to go back to the earlier conversation about Crawford and Peter were good friends. That's how I met Peter. And I think that there was a sense at that time in the administration that the more we could reduce barriers between disciplines, the better off Duke was going to be, that it would be one of the things that would set us apart. I cannot tell you how many times over the last 25 years I've talked to faculty about why they came to Duke. And one of the first things many of them say is, my other university talked about interdisciplinary work, but the barriers were so high it was difficult. When I came to Duke, I found that it was very easy to move across disciplinary boundaries and even school boundaries. So if we look on the science side, between engineering and the medical center. So Duke just created a bunch of opportunities by lowering barriers.
Thank you for that. I think that this follows on from what you just said. This idea of lowering barriers, and also the project of the Franklin Center, right? Which I'd really like us to talk about now. So those of you who were here for the conversation between Kathy Davidson and Carla Holloway will remember that the project of the Franklin, some of you will just remember this, in fact. But let me remind you, the project, there was a project to create the Franklin Center. And at the time of its creation, and please do correct me because I came in 2000, so I was sort of the happy recipient of what had already been created pretty much in terms of the structure, and then watched it grow in the way in which you created, really. But the project was to name a center after John Hope Franklin, right? First of all, but also to include in that something of the shape of a scholarly background that John Hope Franklin really embodied, and that was, from one point of view, mine, an interdisciplinarity of sort, a deep investment in history and in the law, right? An understanding that that the study of the local, the national, and the international should not be put at odds with each other, but actually were necessary to understand something like the history of enslavement, right? To have a commitment to the development of educational possibilities, such that John Hope Franklin's first job at NC Central became something very important for to build a relationship both with Central and also HBCUs more generally, right? These were all things that were very important at that moment. And one of the things that was in that, well, a couple of things that were in the center were FHI, as I understand it, the newly combined African and African American Studies department, and international studies, right, including the various different groups that went into the formation of international studies. So, it's quite a project, And I'm hoping that you can both reflect on what it meant to be putting together and realizing the possibilities of that project.
So I will say that the very first grants for FHI, Mimi O'Brien worked on. But one of the things that Mimi taught me as I came in was that you want to talk with the highest level person you can who is engaged and talk to them about what their big vision is. And then you want to talk with all of the people who are going to be engaged. And so sometimes for a proposal that we would put together, I might talk to anywhere between 25 and 50 people. And it would be combinations of, quick phone call, run into somebody in the hallway, or actually sitting down with a group of faculty or administrators to talk about what we needed and who was going to do the work. And I think that one of the things that the original FHI really got right was that combination of ideals and concepts with who was going to do the work. And I think Rob can speak in great part to, herding the cats and making sure that all the voices were heard and figuring out how to operationalize the concepts. And part of that was the money.
Well, one of the things that was most important, sort of Beth pointed out, was proximity to the faculty, getting to know them, going to their talks, but also proximity of staff. The Franklin Humanities Institute actually started in the attic of a building on Campus Drive. And Mark Olson, who's the first administrator for it, was up there in a not a very pleasant attic. It had no fire escape. They gave us a rope ladder at one point. But he was also in there with a graduate student from political science by the name of Craig Broviak, who's now a professor at Haverford, I think. And they worked together for a couple of years and got to know each other. And of course, I would hang up upstairs with them a lot. And we just began to pull together. And how do we get conversations going? One of our first efforts, and this was even before Oceans Connect, when we had just the Ford grant for the graduate students, was to have a talk with graduate students with Bob Cohan and Walter Mignolo. Can you do interdisciplinary studies? And that room we were way above the fire code. It was wonderful. And people got to know each other. Of course, at that time, it was always pizza on top of everything else. And it began to work. And I'm not sure how you maintain a network other than just being active all the time and talking to people. But at one point, we had 5 programs going, 2 Fords, Ellen Sawyer, a Title VI, and a small grant from the Biddle Foundation for Globalization and the Artist. And it was about keeping all those people connected and talking. And whether it was an undergrad, and I'd like to point out that 2 of our undergrads that were involved in all this are now faculty at prominent universities, to find out what was interesting them. We would just get together constantly. This goes back to the Eve Sedgwick of always being open. We had people, and then when we moved to the Franklin Center, we had to have a night manager. Who were those night managers initially? Graduate students from Tom's department, art and art history, anthropology, political science. They all got together. 2 of them even married. And they're still married. To talk. It was all these conversations that we would have that would then turn into grant applications. and ways of thinking about how we can pull in new people. It did have its limits. We were still struck with the problem of area studies as something that they wanted to protect themselves. And eventually, Duke was so proud when it became the school with the most area studies programs in the country. We had 6 at one point. And I'm going, this is not good. This is not going to work. And a couple of years later, it didn't work, but that's neither here nor there. So it was these conversations. I don't know how you do it. I mean, I guess you could have your porch open 24 hours a day for people to come up to and sit at, or something like that. But that was important. And when I look at all the graduate students that have gone through the program, to the various programs that we had, and I did a count last night, there are over, if I look at 97 to 2002, which was sort of the heyday for us, we had over 30 graduate students go through there who are now tenure or tenure track faculty at other universities in the US. And there are other people like Chris, Mark Olson, who got his PhD while he was working for us, Victoria Ludwig, who were involved, who stayed within the academic world. But how you replicate that? Beth, how do you replicate that?
Well, so one of the things that struck me as you were talking is that, of course, in those days, this was all pre-email. I mean, email was barely started. The World Wide Web was something new. So we did so much of this sort of collaboration, convening, bringing people together. The old-fashioned way, we call people up. We'd put an ad in the Chronicle. They were just, you'd put a poster up in departments. And it was a different circulation of ideas and relationships. And so these situations where, what was going on in the first iteration of the Franklin Humanities Institute was incredibly important because it did provide that happy, and I mean that in an important way, happy convening place where people wanted to hang out and talk to each other. It was, my understanding is that in the 70s, or maybe it was the early 80s, there was an effort made to scatter departments across buildings, and the people in the departments didn't like it. So they regathered them all up into actual departments with all the offices together. And what the early FHI allowed was, again, that breaking down of barriers. You walk down the hall and the person you were talking to was not your colleague in your department, but rather someone in a different discipline and maybe even someone outside your sector. Because you did see at times the fact that, all the social scientists hung together, all the humanities people hung together, and then the scientists were all somewhere else. But this allowed that motion among them. And I think that part of the function of the current Franklin Humanities Institute is that it still is gathering people across disciplines for that serendipitous conversation that then results in, a shared article, a shared grant proposal, new ideas, new ways of teaching.
Thank you. I mean, I'm struck by this question of the serendipitous, that it is serendipity, but it's also a kind of, it's about the construction of spaces and the development of an ethos of hospitality to some extent. But not only hospitality, it's actually quite carefully curated, right? Such that people might bump into each other in the spaces that are provided. I mean, at the moment, there's a conference starting over the other side which is on African studies and Black studies, right? So actually goes back to something that was happening in the Franklin Center now. And so there's been a lot of sort of, bumping into people that's been going on. Former graduate students are here, et cetera, as well. And so, the space needs to be there. Something has changed. This is something that came up in the discussions with Eve Sedgwick's former students, especially, and that is the sort of movement in and out of personal spaces, right? The personal relationships are obviously maintained here, but there is something that has happened to institutions of higher education more generally, which has something to do with professionalization. Now, I'm always happy to have people stop by on my porch, by the way. But that's not it. It's not the norm. For good reason, there aren't as many gatherings in people's homes for ADA questions, et cetera, et cetera. These are very real concerns that we have to engage with. Not everyone is, able to in their home comfortably accommodate someone who isn't able to, go up the stairs or whatever it may be. But all these shifts to spaces that have to actually be designed and maintained does make a difference. It definitely makes a difference. But something that you've both worked on a lot is to create spaces of seminars, of reading groups, of working groups through these grant applications that have really sustained relationships for a long time. And I remember soon after I got here, it was a moment of massive growth of the feminist faculty on campus. I remember being on this was in the days when assistant professors weren't so protected, actually, from a lot of work. Well, there was one year when I was on 3 search committees in the 3 departments that I'm affiliated with, and there was, I remember one of those departments was the Women's Studies, now Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies department. And a number of the people who were finalists in that search ended up being employed by other departments in other searches. And Rob, I remember you went to Robin Wiegman and said, why don't you and a couple of your faculty members put together something? And we put together Feminism, Transnationalism, and the International, a group that had all those young feminist faculty, and we met for some time. So there was there were things like that, but also Oceans Connect. That was in its sort of last couple of years when I arrived. I'd love to hear more about that, and I know. I think Charlie is around somewhere. Yes, he was one of the people in that group as well. So, yeah.
Oceans Connect was, in a way, serendipitous, as you said, because we had tried the year, 3 years before, to do an area studies grant that was built around Oceans Connect ideas. This was when John Richards was still in the faculty in the history department. And he was big on unbinding areas, that we didn't want comparative blocks here and there. We wanted to see how ideas, people, products moved. And that eventually, through 2 faculty members who are now at Stanford, became Oceans Connect. But even there is a little curious undercurrent to that, is that we had a pilot grant and then the full grant. The pilot grant was pretty aggressive in its attack on area studies. When we put in the full grant, we were told to be more cautious about it. As a matter of fact, there is a letter from Nan to someone at Ford saying, we see we're following you in recognizing the importance of area studies. But I'd say that in fact, many of the people involved in Oceans Connect were not area studies people. I mean, I would not think of Ian Balcom as an area studies person. I mean, Charlie clearly is. But he also realizes that there are borders to be crossed. But a lot of the people, Walter Mignolo, who's involved, Bruce Lawrence and Miriam Cook, you, Srinivas, you didn't quite fit into the area studies, but you were interested in what was going on. That was the history of what connected people, whether it was the movement of religious ideas. And we came at a time when the notion of connective history was just emerging. At the time we got our first grant, there was a major article by Sanjay Subramanian on connective history. So we were doing things the right way, and it got a lot of faculty involved, including a lot of faculty who I was surprised got involved. I mean, let me tell you, the English department was one of my hardest barriers initially in getting interdisciplinary studies to work. But there were a lot of English language faculty who got involved, a lot of grad students. So they saw something in there. And it's sort of nice, whether it's the feminism globalization. I still remember Gayatri Spivak's talk, which was quite a coup, I gather. That people were interested. I mean, Robin was also involved in critical US studies, which was going to be, because how can you do area studies when you're told never to involve the US? When we proposed programs that involved the US, we were told to cut them, which was kind of strange. So, you know, that's how we had to work. Sort of incrementally, we had our primary restaurant at one point. If anyone remembers Brightleaf 905, I supported them for years, very successfully. Not for them, but for us. So, okay.
Yeah, something that just struck me is, while I was not part of the planning or the execution of Oceans Connect, looking at the documents as we were preparing for this panel, it really struck me how many of the ideas that then were carried forward into the Sawyer seminars were already in those documents. The convening of faculty, the inclusion of graduate students, the cross-disciplinary efforts, the assumption that you had to, again, break down the barriers in order for ideas and understanding to flow. One of the early ideas with the Sawyer seminars was also the fact that different disciplines speak different languages. And you've got to help the people engaged with each other understand the nuances behind the use of sometimes the same word in very different contexts. And I think that that also then eventually flowed into the work that that went on in the Franklin Humanities Center around vertical integration all the way down to undergraduates. The idea that, you know, you have both expertise and novice voices in a room, and that will change the conversation. So what was fascinating to me was how many of these things sort of flowed out of that early grant.
So, did you want to?
Well, I just want to say, I don't think I wrote a major grant that did not have vertical integration to it. We just assumed that you had to have it. So there was money for faculty to do research, stipends for book publications. Graduate students got travel money, got money for language studies. Even undergraduates got money for travel if they were involved. So that eventually became a bit, why wouldn't you do it that way? I mean, every faculty member assumed that and liked that idea.
And I think that has remained the case at FHI. The labs, the humanities labs certainly have three, somewhere between 2 and 4, usually faculty members, sometimes librarians working together, and working with graduate students on both in terms of courses, but also in a range of extracurricular stuff, and undergraduate courses as well, and the development of research and courses that don't yet exist at Duke, right? So that's something that we've absolutely maintained. I would love to actually speak now a little bit about Ford and Mellon and what they've done over the years for FHI. I mean, I think that there has actually never been a point, and maybe this year is the end of it, where we haven't had some Mellon funding, right? And Ford, not for a while now, right? And we know that the foundations that have traditionally supported the humanities have turned direction somewhat, perhaps away from higher education, but also to some extent in a move to make universities like Duke accountable for the humanities, right? If you think about something like FHI, which doesn't have a massive budget compared to some of the other institutes, for example, one might say, well, absolutely, the university should be supporting that, and they will, right? For the foreseeable future, anyway. Obviously, we, like anyone else, we do our budget each year with a plan for the next few. But tell us, Beth, maybe we can start with you this time. There have been so many Mellon grants that you've worked on, and I would just love to hear about them. And I know you brought this color-coded chart, which I would love everyone else to see. It's kind of extraordinary.
So when I came into Foundation Relations, Mimi O'Brien had been working with the Mellon Foundation. And she, trained me up and helped me to understand both what the foundation was hoping to do. Because, of course, every foundation has a mission. And when they give grants, they are actually looking for agents to achieve their mission. So part of what we have to do is look for the foundation that wants to do what we want to do. And I think that there was a period of time between about 2003 and 2014 where what Duke University was doing in the humanities and what the Mellon Foundation wanted to do were in lockstep. It was staggering. So here's the color chart. This is the list of Mellon proposals that I worked on over the last 25 years. The pink ones are the ones we got. So you can see there's that whole swath where we just got everything. And it was from, like I said, the first FHI grant I didn't work on, but I worked on, I think, all but the last one, in part because I then handed that work over to other people and they worked on it. But there was a point with Mellon where we were literally submitting for every cycle. They had 4 cycles a year, and we were getting as many as 3 or 4 grants per cycle. And that was across Franklin Humanities Center, the Nasher, Art and Art History, the libraries. We had Mellon Mays funding and have had Mellon Mays funding for more than 30 years. It was just, and of course, on our side, we had Dick Broadhead as president. Srinivas Aravamudan was Dean of the Humanities. Ian Balcom was running the Franklin Humanities Institute. So that's 3 senior English faculty. And then eventually, of course, Dick Broadhead went onto the board of the Mellon Foundation. And they have a very good, careful system where Dick recused himself when a Duke University proposal was under consideration. But the fact that he was on the board was huge. So a couple of interesting quick things. One is that at one point, Dick had gone up to Mellon to a convening that they held of provosts and presidents to talk about the humanities. And Dick came back and he shook his head and he said, I don't get it. All of the other people who had been in the room were out there going, woe is us, our humanities are dying, give us money. And he came back and he said, no, where are the ideas? Where's the interesting stuff? Why aren't they pitching the coolest thing since sliced bread? And he didn't use this phrase, but why aren't they pitching some great, interesting idea? And so we started kicking stuff around. And by that was probably in about, 05, 06. And we had a very strong relationship with them, and they were funding lots of things. And they would periodically call us up and go, we have a couple $1 million. Do you have an idea? Which is like the gold standard for foundation relations. It's like when they come to you and ask you for something, you're doing something right. So, and that was when we started putting together Humanities Writ Large. I think that the first one where they called us up and said, we have some money, actually went to visual studies. Yes. Sorry. So we had, Peter was the liaison with Mellon because Dick couldn't be, because Dick was on the board. And so Peter, when we got this call, called me up and said, look around, talk to some people, bring me some ideas. And so we talked to a bunch of people, and we brought Peter, I think, 3 or 4 ideas. And he went, okay, I like this one, and one of them was visual studies. And so we wrote them up and pitched them. And Mellon came back and said, yeah, we like that visual studies one. So then we wrote the proposal and got the grant. The other piece of this that I think was a contributing factor is that when you look at who was running the Mellon Foundation, so especially Don Randall in those early years, there was a circulation of relationships around the universities that the leaders of the Mellon Foundation had attended and the leaders here at Duke. So we had Princeton connections, Cornell connections, Yale connections, and that mattered. That was all sort of running in the background. I'm trying to remember what the original question was.
No, this is great. It was, tell me about the Mellon grants.
Yeah. I know the other piece that I wanted to speak to. So one of the things about Mellon was that for that whole period, we were just running in tandem. And they loved what we were doing. They asked us for ideas. We went to them with ideas. I remember one trip, I went with Dick Broadhead to staff his meeting with them. We met with Don Randall and Joe Mizell and some other people at Mellon. And that was when we pitched Humanities writ large. And it was originally a $7 million proposal. And I had edited and worked with Dick and Srinivas and Ian on it, which is sort of scary for me, which was, working with 3 English professors, and I'm the one who's telling them what to write. But it worked. And so we got up there and we're pitching this idea to them. We wrote the proposal and then pitched it. We didn't send them the proposal first. And as we were talking to Don Randall, Don said, Mellon Foundation has never given a grant larger than $5 million. And Dick and I kind of looked at each other, and I think I said, well, what would you like us to cut? Which idea is not worthy? And they kind of looked at each other, and, so they ended up funding $6 million. And the other thing that happened during that meeting was that was the first time we had pitched bringing in young faculty from liberal arts colleges and HBCUs. And so Dick had presented the idea, and Don turned to one of the program officers and said, did you already send out that RFP? RFP is a request for proposals. And the program officer said, no, I haven't mailed it yet. I haven't sent it out yet. We were pitching the idea that they were going to ask for proposals for. So it was, right in alignment. I will say that, there has been a super turn in the last 5 years, a little bit more, away from funding Research One universities. I think that the R1s got a lot of money for a long time. And I do think that many of the major funders have turned toward community colleges, HBCUs, the less wealthy and less well-established state universities are now getting much more money. And I do think, part of that is driven by who's running the foundations. Part of it is driven by changes in the way we think about things. For the Ford Foundation, right after Darren Walker came in, I also went with Dick Broadhead to pitch some ideas to Darren Walker. And Darren looked Dick in the face and said, Ford Foundation does not think universities are good partners, which was a shocker. And I think that Ford then did spend about 5 years when they were not funding universities very much at all. We're now seeing more awards coming back to universities from the Ford Foundation. We've had a few exceptions. Carrie Haney has always had very good support from the Ford Foundation, even during that period. But what the next turn will be for them, I don't know. I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is that the National Endowment for the Humanities has a smaller budget than either Mellon Foundation or Ford Foundation. And so when they turn away from the work we're doing, that's a really big hole to try and fill any other way. And I do think that one of the ways that Duke has stepped up to take care of that is by providing a hardline budget for the Franklin Humanities Institute. And I don't know how long you've had a hardline budget. I don't remember.
Yes. I mean, it's been a while. It's been a while now, yeah. So that of course it's been huge for us. But we have to negotiate things as we go along, as we want to work on different projects. That's definitely the case. I would say that in many ways there are other kinds of challenges. There's the lack of foundation support for institutions like Duke, and as I said in the beginning, in many ways for exactly the kinds of reasons that we would have been doing the work that we did over so long, right? At Duke, we have a particular moment that's combined with the fact that the Dean of the Humanities is our senior humanist in the administration, right? Which is very different than it was before, right? Or maybe, and me, right? In those kinds of administrative positions, right? It's a very, very different scene than it was. And so very often we are in a position where we are needing to explain what research is in the humanities, because research has now become a term that is associated with getting grants more generally and not actually with the scholarly protocols of our fields, for example, right? So we spend a lot of time explaining things like that in order to be part of the central conversation, to remind the university that actually the humanities is at the core of a university project and has to be at the core of a university project, unless we are going to completely shift our understanding. Well, I mean, obviously there has been a complete shift in the understanding of what universities are. But I think that, that this isn't just in order to say, we need to go back, we need to retreat. It's not a nostalgia for another moment. God knows there are bad things that came with even the kinds of networks that many of us have benefited from in the past. We know that there are people who are left out of those networks, that nothing happens for those people because of the kind of serendipity that has allowed for certain kinds of things to work. But we do need to have ways of actually having more of a presence in the construction of projects at the university-wide level. And it is difficult, it is definitely difficult when success is often counted in terms of dollars brought in, right? And foundations are not supporting us in the same way. When we never get to talk to donors, and that's also another problem as far as this is concerned. So that's the kind of value, in a sense, that is assigned to, there's a value that's assigned to those who bring in money, and we never get the chance to do it, right? But we still want to insist that we have to be part of all the conversations that are going on. So for example, with something like climate change, we've been working on questions on the environmental humanities. I was noticing, Rob, in the document that you kindly shared with me about the early groups working on the environment. That's been a consistent interest, focus, site of production of work for us, and yet we are not part of the conceptualization of the project around climate, for example. So it's not only that we don't get money from it, which we don't, by the way, but it's also that it is conceived in a way where we would always be asking in a form that doesn't fit into the kinds of scholarship that we do, right, for the crumbs that they might send our way, which they don't.
So I did want to say that there were two things recently that made me happy. One is that when the new curriculum was announced, the arts and humanities got their designation as being essential to our undergraduate education and got a full quarter of sort of the headlines. And I think that is really important I had feared as we were sliding farther and farther toward the natural sciences and engineering that the humanities might just lose that foothold. And so I thought that was a real win. The second thing is that our provost, who is not a humanities person, obviously, has spoken multiple times in public about the importance of the humanities. And I am heartened by that. I think that when our senior faculty officer makes that kind of statement in public, it does mean something. And then the third thing that I would say, which is not positive, but I also think is not negative, is that our major efforts now in the university for the sciences and on sort of the engineering and medical side of the world are so expensive that I think we sometimes forget that the humanities are not. And we need to remind our leaders that Duke's original climb into prominence came on the backs of humanities faculty, and that the amount of money spent for the entire group of people that were hired in the mid-'80s and early '90s would not buy one scientist right now. I'm not kidding. And so when you look at getting funding and getting support for the humanities, you just have to keep reminding them of the scale. Remember that $1 million in the humanities goes a long ways. And I think that that's a good argument about how we continue to make sure that our humanities and arts are funded properly.
And then to spend what we're given.
Yes. Spend the money.
Always spend, yes.
To build on what Beth was saying, granted I left Duke in 2015, so there's 10 years I don't know about. But it was always my role and the role of other administrators to be trying to connect at a smaller scale faculty with money. Sometimes it was our own money. We'd give them, $10,000 for a conference. But we could then build on that. We had something we could anchor from. And so that, Ranjana, people who are the administrators have to be doing close readings of everything that comes out, either from the administration, and granted, I was very lucky. All our administrators loved the humanities. Or the foundations. My last grant at Duke was a Luce Foundation, and it started by me looking at Luce and wondering, what could we do? And then connecting dots. And eventually we got a grant from them, apparently, and they had said this will be a one-time grant, and it's been more than one time, hasn't it? So there are ways of doing it, but you have to be very conscious, proactive, and sort of targeting people. Granted, with the Luce, we targeted a very interesting, productive faculty member for it. So, that works, but you have to take the chance. And I would say conversations that I've had with about grants with faculty, most of them went nowhere. And that's fine. But there are plenty of others you keep talking to. And it goes nowhere if they don't get the grant, then they get a little angry, but
Yeah,
that happens.
You do have to set expectations.
Yeah.
You're not going to get every proposal. It's just not going to happen. But if we keep working at it and we keep understanding, like I said, if you go back to the foundation's mission, what are they trying to get done? And are we the right people to do that for them? That helps our chances go up.
Thank you. I think we should turn to our audience now, and I'm just thinking, Laura, you worked on the Mellon grants. Certainly, Chris also, and has consistently, I think, since you arrived, Chris, the HBCU liberal arts colleges relationships is really built on, and we're now at a point where that's going to be difficult to fund, when it's never, as you said yesterday, when it's never looked better than it does now. That's going to be a difficult thing to fund.
I have a suggestion for that, by the way.
Excellent.
If you have some very good HBCU partners, ask them to apply and write us in. Because they'll get the money we want.
They haven't always liked to do it that way. So that's something that, in fact, we discussed with the Mellon Foundation. They asked us about exactly this, as you know. Yes, yes, but something's changed.
Logistical issues. Yeah.
Please. Questions from the audience, comments. It doesn't have to be a question. Tom, sure.
I'd like to know what you learned the hardest way. What did you learn the hard way?
How long do you have? So I have one thing. I love faculty, and I have worked with hundreds and hundreds of them over the last 25 years. You can't make them do anything. I think that was the hardest thing for me to learn, which is that just because there is a fabulous idea does not mean that the people that you were talking to want to do it. And the only way to have a successful proposal, grant, and completion is to have the people engaged really want to do it. So I think that, for me, that was the biggest lesson, which is, run it by people. If they want to go with it, then it's a good idea. How about you?
That. And I, particularly with the Department of Economics, I've had a lot of experience with that.
Yeah.
Great ideas. But also, a department or group of faculty may not be interested because, one, it's too little money. Talking to the people in medicine. And secondly, that they're worried that it will infringe on their territory. Which is, Duke, for all its interdisciplinarity, still has that, at least I assume it still has it. And sometimes it's more, and you get dismissed. If I go talk to Global Health, and I'm the person in the humanities, they're going to look at me quizzically. Why are you coming here? This is not an issue for us. So yeah. But if you're successful 25% of the time, that's really good.
For federal funding, if you get 10 to 12% of what you ask for, that's good. As you get into the humanities, because so many of the humanities funders have relationships with us, our success rate was higher. But it's still, so out of the 400 proposals I've submitted, I got about half. And that's really good. That means half the time they said no. So you have to.
This is not really a question, but just, I think, a comment and just appreciation. If I could indulge in a fun anecdote also, that some of you have already heard me tell, but I just love to tell the story about the relationships that are built, like at the Franklin Center specifically, but like the reason that I have this, well, this job that's evolved to, well, whatever, but the reason that I got a job at the FHI in the first place was because, as those of you who know me, I eat a lot of meals at Bonds on 9th Street. And I remember, I'd finished my PhD. I had a full-time job at the Multicultural Center where I'd worked at as a graduate student, so I was very happy at that job. But I had actually I finished my dissertation in the Franklin Center when I was working for Ann Allison and Leo Chang for their Asian and Asian American Studies Center. So, I got to know Rob through that context. And so one day I was eating lunch at Bonds, as I, continue to do. But I was sitting at the window, and Rob just happened to walk by on 9th Street. And he stopped and he poked his head in and was like, "Oh, there's a job opening at the FHI, and like, you might be interested in it." I wasn't looking for a job, and I was like, "Well, but this does sound like something I would be interested in," and so that's how I've been at the FHI ever since. So it's just a fun little anecdote that I always like to tell, and I'm always grateful to Rob for that. And I also just want to say, maybe slightly more substantively, that just from hearing this conversation, this is sort of like I feel like my ideas have cohered for me, and I've kind of like an agenda set for like the next few months. And I talk to you, Lightsy, and Carol, for a few things. So I just want to thank you for like getting the gears turning about new relationships that we can, build and things to look at, and maybe just run our heads into the wall a bit again. We have a tough head. So, anyways, okay, sorry.
Thank you, both of you. To piggyback on what Chris was saying, and what Rob was talking about the community building and having people in the same space chatting, even on the admin side, even on the non-intellectual side of things, it was very important for all of us staff people managing those area centers to make those connections, and we were able to facilitate collaborations even from the admin side, and to this day, it's still a community. It's like, hey, Franklin Center buddy, I worked with you 20 years ago, and we're still like, we happen to be again in the same building. But it is those connections have had long-lasting effects in creating networks across the entire university when people have moved to other areas. Like, hey, I know someone in that office, I can call on them for help. And it's just been, from the workers' perspective, it's been a wonderful experience too. So thank you for all that work and for its ancillary positive effects.
One of the things that makes me happy is thinking about the work that we began through Humanities Unbounded with Durham Tech and what that's growing into now, and how that speaks to a changing ethos at Duke University that I think is a really good thing. And that I want to make sure people remember that started with the support of the Mellon Foundation.
Right, absolutely. Do you want to actually say a little bit more about it, Laura?
Under Humanities writ large,
everyone
which
knows.
was the first 5 years, $6 million that turned into 7 years, $7 million. We began bringing in visiting faculty from liberal arts colleges, HBCUs, and other minority-serving institutions. In the second application, which became Humanities Unbounded, that was moved from a focus on liberal arts colleges and HBCUs to working with Durham Tech. And so we began working with Durham Tech faculty, having them have access to Duke resources and having the ability to engage with them and they with us. And from that partnership and the terrific leadership of David Long, who was their Dean of Arts and Sciences, is how these conversations have gotten going that is now changing the relationship between the two institutions.
Yeah, thank you. And it's also actually kept a kind of medical humanities theme going as well, because that's something that's been quite specific with Durham Tech. Thanks. Thanks for that.
I'm just an outsider in passing, but I wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed your conversation about social engagement as being part of research leadership. It's critical, and I just really wanted to say how much I appreciated that and a great idea to involve that in your series. And I also thought you'd like to know, I'm here for a boot camp at the National Humanities Centre, and the president of Duke University will be speaking tomorrow evening about the value of the humanities to the modern research university. So maybe things are looking up.
Very nice. We'll try to get him to come over here and do the same. You can use the same speech if he likes.
Yeah, I just want to say, gosh, Rob, I mean, you probably don't remember me. I'm Lou Brown. We met a long time ago when I was at the Keenan Institute, and, you know, that was just, I remember going over to some of the events that you were having at the Franklin Center that were bringing in economists and political scientists and historians and just those wonderful, rich, cross-disciplinary conversations. So that's looking to the past, and this might be more a question for you, Beth, but, you know, we've talked about Mellon and Ford and Luce, and, you know, those are traditional funders. What's the future, and where should we be looking?
So I should kick that to Lightsey Darst, who's in the audience. But I will just say quickly that I think that you have to look everywhere. I think that you have to keep your eyes open. I think Google is a tremendous tool. And it is not, it won't necessarily.
I'm sorry, it won't necessarily be the traditional funders, but it might be. One of the ways that I think our group is working hard is, so Foundation Relations now has 2 research people. So we have capacity to help people find the right funder to go to in the foundation space. The other thing that I would say is that Duke is better, but we're still siloed in terms of helping faculty and programs find funding from different sources. Because really the place with the deep pockets usually is the federal government. But I think you want to connect with people who can help you do the research and just keep your eyes open. There's Duke, the Office of Research Support, I think, still runs the funding alert. There is a tremendous database that a group outside of our office runs that lists all of the opportunities that they know about. And you can search that database. You can have stuff that runs automatically on your desktop that will pull things when it comes out. So part of it is connecting with people who can help you. Part of it is keeping your eyes open. And part of it is being willing to collaborate with unusual partners. I think all of those will help.
I've got a comment going back to the community colleges. I don't know how many of you know this, but one of the greatest innovations in North Carolina education was the creation of the community colleges in North Carolina. I think there are 50 of them about, and they are all within an evening's drive of people. So I worked with them years ago, and it is such a productive, and there are great scholars who've chosen to be at community colleges throughout the state. So I don't know if Durham the Tech has an expansion element to it, but it's out there, and they love, at least they did in the 80s, loved working with Duke because that gave them access, literal access to the library. So,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, something I will also say, and I know that we have to close off in a sec, but actually, there we go. Yes, we do have to. But I will say also that the community colleges are the institutions in which the humanities is still growing in terms of the majors. You know, the students actually deciding to study the humanities. You know, it's happening in the community colleges more than in any other kind of institution of higher education. And I will also say, I mean, and Laura, please, and Beth, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think when I came into the last few meetings of the conceptualization of Humanities Unbounded, even though I'm now the PI. Anyway, but as I remember it, it was the Mellon Foundation who said to us, do something with the community colleges.
That's what I recall as well.
I mean, after, they'd looked at the proposal once or twice, they said, do something with the community. It's great that you've done lots with HBCUs and with liberal arts colleges, but now the next step is community colleges. And so.
The community college system in North Carolina is a little bit like the City University of New York. Their students want to be there. They are working full-time jobs. So they're curious. They may be very impatient with faculty occasionally, I found out. But they are curious and they love it. So it's something, if you could create a larger network, count me in. They are great people to work with. Sorry.
We are past time. I want to say a huge thank you to all the work that you have done over the years. Honestly, I mean, coming in 2000, I've said this in a number of the different sessions. I just couldn't even believe the feast of things that were available at Duke. When I first got here, I thought we'd moved from Seattle, and I thought, oh my God, big mistake. It's so hot. It's not a city, it's a swamp. What am I going to do? I'm a city girl, all those things. But it's actually, I have to say, all the stuff that was going on at the Franklin Center and the Humanities that made it just an incredibly stimulating place to be. And so I want to thank you enormously personally, but also for the amazing environment really that has been created by the work that you've done. And, I mean, as you say, that you're often in the background, and I'm really happy to have had this opportunity to bring you into the foreground and to thank you formally, and thank you all for coming here today.
Thank you, Ranji.